Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hey friends, and welcome to our first episode of the new year. Happy 2026. And also our first episode in our next deep dive. Woo! So the topic of our next deep dive is, drum roll please, the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. Probably not a spoiler at this point because it would be in the title of the episode, but anyway, still exciting. The social doctrine of the Catholic Church. I'm super excited to talk about this topic. In this deep dive over the next few episodes, we're going to start taking a really close look at the compendium of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. So this is a resource that was published in 2004 during the papacy of Pope John Paul II. The compendium brings together and summarizes all of the Church's key social teachings. And these social teachings are so important for us today in the 21st century, because these are the principles that help to govern social and economic and political life. And as I'm sure we all know, we are living in a world where there is a lot of social and political and economic strife and disagreement. And so it's really important for us as Catholics to understand what the Catholic Church teaches about these things. So in this deep dive, we probably won't cover the entire compendium in one go because it's kind of hefty. Instead, we're going to focus on a portion of it now, and then we'll return to the rest of it in a later deep dive. But for this series, we're going to start by taking a close look at the key philosophical, moral, and theological principles that sit under Catholic social teaching. But before we get to that, in this episode, we're going to do a kind of broad introduction to Catholic social teaching. So we're going to ask the questions, what actually is social doctrine? What is it? Why do we have it? Is it necessary? Why is it necessary? And then we're going to do a quick history of social doctrine and how it has developed over the last kind of 100 or so years in the Catholic Church, because that kind of overview is going to help orient us and give us some context to what social teaching is and why it's so important for us today. So that's what we're going to do in this episode, sort of orient ourselves with a kind of broad introduction to social doctrine, beginning with that fundamental question, what is social doctrine? So social doctrine is an area of Catholic teaching that relates to the way that human beings function in societies. So social doctrine kind of begins with the question of what the human person is, and it then goes on to consider how human beings should relate to each other when they come together to form societies. So what are the moral principles that should guide the way that societies function? There's a book by a Jesuit priest called Father Roger Charles called An Introduction to Catholic Social Teaching. It's really good. I highly recommend it. And in that book, Father Charles writes that Catholic social teaching deals with the question of man's place in nature and in human society. So that's what social doctrine is. So the next term that it would be useful to define before we go any further is society, because that term is going to come up a lot. So what does the Catholic Church actually mean when she makes reference to human beings in societies? Well, Father Charles writes that society can mean any association of persons who come together to achieve a common end. So basically, as human beings, we generally don't live in isolation. We're not just bubbles that kind of float around independently of everything and everyone else. Naturally, as human beings, we form societies. In other words, we come together as groups to work towards shared goals. So that's the kind of broadest definition of what a society is. An association of persons who come together to achieve a common end or goal. So a society can range from something really small scale, like a social club or a charity, all the way up to large and complex societies, such as nations, in which people are united by a shared identity or sense of values and purpose. So Catholic social teaching provides moral principles that will help to guide and structure the way that human beings function when they come together to form societies. Now, the principles of Catholic social teaching can apply to any kind of society. However, they are most commonly applied in the context of political societies, so things like nations and states. Now, here's a question. Why does the church have social doctrine in the first place? Like, is it necessary for the Catholic Church to offer teachings about the way that human societies should function? Because it might seem to us like the Catholic Church is potentially like stepping out of the bounds of her remit by offering guidance to political and economic societies. Because as Catholics, we believe in a distinction between church and state, right? Like, the role of the church is to provide spiritual and moral guidance to people and not to rule over them politically. And then on the flip side, the role of political parties and rulers of nations is to provide legal and civic order and not to exercise spiritual authority over people. So if there's this distinction between church and state, is it appropriate for the Catholic Church to have social doctrine? Well, the answer to that question is yes, provided that we understand what social doctrine is in its proper sense. So this again comes from Father Charles. He writes, "The church has no competence in the technicalities of sociology, nor in political or economic theory and organization. Each has its own legitimate authority under reason and the natural law. The church's competence is in giving guidance on the moral and spiritual consequences of the decisions and policies made in these spheres. She has the right to give us such guidance because these consequences affect the good of mankind made in God's image and likeness." Okay, that's a bit of a hefty quote, but basically what he's saying there is that the church has no role in telling people in technical terms how economies should run. The church doesn't design political systems or social structures. That is not the role of the church. She doesn't prescribe particular political or economic systems or endorse specific political parties. That's not the role of the church. But what the church is concerned with are the moral principles that guide the decisions that societies make. Because politics and morality are not the same thing, but there is overlap between them, right? There are moral principles that sit under the political choices that we make. And that moral sphere is of great concern to the church. So the church is never going to come out and say that, every country should tax its citizens to this specific extent, or that everyone needs to vote for this politician. So the church isn't going to talk about those sort of specifics, but what she might say, or does say, is that every person has a right to private property, but that the right to private property is not absolute, and it needs to be exercised in accordance with justice and the common good. So you might be able to see here the distinction between the moral principles that should guide the way that we do things and the specifics of how exactly those principles should be implemented. The church is interested in the moral principles that guide social life, but not in the technical specifics of their application, because that area is the realm of economists and politicians and sociologists. However, as Father Charles points out, there are moral and spiritual consequences of political decisions. So there's that overlap between politics and morality. And there are therefore moral and spiritual principles that should guide those political decisions. Principles around things like human rights, the role and the importance of the family in society, the principle of subsidiarity, which are all principles that we're going to look at. So those are the areas where the Catholic Church has not only the right, but also the responsibility to give us guidance. Now, an important thing to remember is that even though the Catholic Church can and does give moral guidance in these areas, she's not prescriptive. So as we've said, she's not interested in the technical specifics of how those principles should be implemented. One of the reasons for that is because there are, in fact, many various legitimate ways in which the principles of Catholic social teaching can be implemented within the bounds of that teaching. So because the Church offers moral principles rather than political programs, this is a really important point to bear in mind. And we're going to see this becoming clear as we do this deep dive, that Catholic social teaching cannot be neatly mapped onto modern political categories, such as left-wing and right-wing politics. So what do we mean by that? What we mean is that Catholic social teaching is not right-wing and it's not left-wing. What we will find as we go through these teachings in the next few episodes is that you'll notice that there are things in there that align more with what we would expect of the political left and things that align more with what we would expect of the political right. So we should never make the mistake of assuming that to be Catholic means to belong to this particular political party, or that you have to be on the right or on the left in order to be Catholic. As a Catholic, within the bounds of legitimate Catholic social teaching, we have the freedom to lean a little more to the left or a little more to the right. But provided that we're not so far to one extreme or the other, that we're violating those moral principles, we have the legitimate freedom as Catholics to lean more to the right or to the left, or to vote for the political party or prefer the political system of our choice. And speaking of violating principles of social teaching, what we do find is that even though there is flexibility to lean a little bit more to the left or a little bit more to the right within Catholic social teaching, the political positions that occupy the extreme ends of either spectrum, so for instance, forms of socialism that deny private property, or forms of capitalism that ignore social responsibility, those extreme ends of the spectrum do end up violating some of those principles. And so they become incompatible with Catholic social teaching. I think that's a really important thing to point out, that to be Catholic does not mean to be either left-wing or right-wing. In fact, I remember hearing that Pope John Paul II refused to allow anyone to use the terms left-wing or right-wing in relation to Catholic social teaching in his presence. Okay, so what we're going to do for the rest of this episode is we're going to look back over the history of social doctrine. We're going to think about how and why this doctrine developed over time, particularly in the last 150 odd years. We'll outline the key church documents in which the social doctrine is set out, and then we'll look at how the compendium of the social doctrine, which was released in 2004, kind of ties everything together. So this journey through the history of social doctrine will help to give us some orientation and some context, and hopefully make it clear to us why this is such an important area of church teaching that remains incredibly relevant and even necessary today. So, the history of social doctrine. The Catholic Church has always had teachings and principles in this area. In fact, we find the principles of social doctrine rooted in Scripture. So ideas like human dignity, the fact that every person is created in the image of God, ideas of concern for the poor, for widows and orphans, the idea of social responsibility, all of these themes appear throughout the Bible. Okay, so we are called as Christians to love our neighbour and to care for the vulnerable, and those themes run through both Scripture and through the Church's teaching across history. It's always been a part of what the Church teaches and believes. In fact, many of the early Church fathers wrote about these issues. So for example, there's a saint called Saint Basil the Great who wrote in the 4th century, and there's a collection of his homilies that is published under the title On Social Justice, which focuses really strongly on our obligations to the poor and the vulnerable. It's actually a really good collection of homilies. I recommend reading it. So from the very first centuries of Christianity onwards, Christian thinkers and leaders have been talking about the principles of human social relations. In the medieval period, St. Thomas Aquinas provided a philosophical framework that would eventually help to shape the official Catholic social doctrine. So St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, for instance, that natural law is the basis of social justice. He wrote about how private property is a legitimate right, but not an absolute right, because material goods are ultimately meant for the benefit of everyone. And that's an idea that later became known as the concept of the universal destination of goods. Aquinas also argued that political authority exists to serve the common good rather than the interests of a privileged few. So we can see the seeds of what would eventually become official Catholic teaching in this area. Okay, so teaching and reflection on social justice and how human beings live together in society have always been part of the Catholic tradition. However, the end of the 19th century saw huge social and economic changes. And these changes became the catalyst for the Catholic Church to begin more directly and officially and systematically to build up a body of social doctrine. So, by the late 19th century, the world was facing what the compendium refers to in paragraph 89 as the first great social question. The first great social question. Basically, industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, had transformed societies. Traditional forms of labor had collapsed. Countries and cities were becoming increasingly urbanized, and large numbers of people were living in serious poverty. So there had been huge social and economic changes worldwide by the end of the 19th century. Now, in response to these changing conditions, workers' movements began to emerge, and many of these workers' movements were influenced by socialist or Marxist ideologies. At the same time, in other parts of the world, unregulated capitalism was contributing to this widespread exploitation and poverty. So for the first time, and more or less on a global scale, there were these urgent questions that were being raised about the rights of workers, the meaning of work, the relationship between employers and employees, private property, the responsibilities of the wealthy, and the protection of the poor and the vulnerable. So this is what the compendium is talking about when it refers to the first great social question. So in response to these challenges, the Pope at the time, Pope Leo XIII, published an encyclical called Rerum Novarum in the year 1891. Rerum Novarum was the Church's first ever social encyclical. So the first encyclical to deal with these questions of social and economic and political life. In this encyclical, Pope Leo XIII addresses this great social question by setting out in a clear and systematic way the Church's position on the major social and economic issues of the time. So the document opens with this incredible description of the injustice that was facing workers at the time. Leo XIII writes that some opportune remedy must be found quickly for the misery and wretchedness pressing so unjustly on the majority of the working class. So Leo XIII is directly responding to the urgent social questions that had arisen at the time, and he proposes some moral principles for finding that remedy. So this is from the compendium, paragraph 89. It says, Rerum Novarum lists errors that give rise to social ills. It excludes socialism as a remedy and expounds with precision and in contemporary terms the Catholic doctrine on work, the right to property, the principle of collaboration instead of class struggle, the rights of the weak, the dignity of the poor, and the obligations of the rich, the perfecting of justice through charity, and the right to form professional associations. So Pope Leo XIII highlights the social problems that were occurring at the time, but clarifies that socialism was not a legitimate response to those problems, and instead lays out some principles and moral guidelines to help find solutions for this great social question. And in fact, Rerum Novarum doesn't just critique socialism, it also critiques unregulated capitalism as a potential solution to the social problems of the day. Now, this document had a huge influence on Christians as well as on future Catholic teaching. So the compendium notes that Rerum Novarum became the document inspiring Christian activity in the social sphere and the point of reference for this activity. So it not only inspired Christians to engage in social life and try to find solutions for the social problems of the time, it also was their point of reference for how they should go about it. Later on in paragraph 90, the compendium says, Rerum Novarum dealt with the labour question using a methodology that would become a lasting paradigm for successive developments in the Church's social doctrine. The whole of the Church's social doctrine can be seen as an updating, a deeper analysis and an expansion of the original nucleus of principles presented in Rerum Novarum. So that's a little bit sort of fancy language, but essentially what the compendium is saying is that Rerum Novarum became the reference point for future Catholic social teaching, and that basically most of the official church documents in this area since then have just expanded on the principles and themes of Rerum Novarum. So we can't overstate the importance of this encyclical. In fact, there are multiple encyclicals on social teaching, but if you could only ever read one, then this is the one that you would read, Rerum Novarum. But even though Rerum Novarum was a landmark document in Catholic social teaching, it wasn't the final word. And the reason for that is that, of course, new social conditions and movements and challenges emerged over time and continue to emerge. And the Church continued to develop and clarify her social teaching in response to those new social conditions and movements. So, for example, in 1929, we had the Wall Street crash, followed by the Great Depression. And then 2 years later, in 1931, Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical called Quadragesimo Anno. And this encyclical returns to the themes of Rerum Novarum 40 years later, but then develops those themes about social justice and the evils of unrestrained capitalism and socialism in light of the specific economic issues of the early 20th century. Now, this encyclical, Quadragesimo Anno, is important because this is the encyclical that explicitly outlined an idea that eventually became known as the principle of subsidiarity. And this is one of the foundational principles of Catholic teaching that we'll look at. 6 years later, in 1937, in response to the rise of communism in countries around the world, Pope Pius XI wrote another encyclical called Divini Redemptoris. And this encyclical was specifically a critique of atheistic communism, which Pius XI describes as intrinsically perverse. So these two papal encyclicals in the early 20th century are responding directly to the economic crises that were occurring at the time and the rise of communism. And then between 1937 and the 1960s, we don't see the publication of any major social encyclicals. However, after the Second World War, the global kind of socio-political landscape had again shifted dramatically. So the second half of the 20th century saw the rise of a more global economy following the Second World War, a growth in international relations. And with that came widening wealth gaps, not just within countries, but between countries. So in many cases, poorer countries were becoming poorer, while wealthier countries were becoming richer, contributing to this widening global inequality. So in response to the growing globalization of the world, the Pope at the time, Pope John the 23rd, released another encyclical called Mater et Magistra in 1961. Now, this encyclical was notable for its international focus. So John the 23rd could see that many of the problems that church social doctrine had previously addressed had been national problems that were occurring within nations, whereas now they were global problems. So this encyclical reminded Christians that, first of all, wealthy nations have a responsibility to help poorer nations while still respecting their cultures, that economic aid should promote the development and independence of poorer countries, so it shouldn't make poorer countries dependent on wealthier nations, that international trade must be governed by justice and not exploitation, and reminded Christians that social justice was now a global issue and not just a national issue. 2 years later, in 1963, during the time of the Cold War and soon after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Pope John the 23rd released another encyclical titled Pacem in Terris, i.e. Peace on Earth. Now, this encyclical was important because it was the first time that a papal encyclical had been explicitly addressed not only to just Catholics, but to all people of goodwill. So Pope John the 23rd, for the first time, was explicitly writing not just to Catholics, but to everyone. And the focus of this encyclical was on the establishment of world peace. John the 23rd wrote that lasting peace would only be possible in societies rooted in truth, justice, charity, freedom, and respect for human rights and the dignity of the person. Okay, so in the 1960s, between 1962 and 1965, we had the Second Vatican Council in the Catholic Church. Now, after the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church released a constitutional document titled Gaudium et Spes. And this is possibly the most significant document of the entire council. Gaudium et Spes is an incredibly broad and wide-ranging document that covers a huge variety of subjects. It's basically an enthusiastic and engaged dialogue with the modern world. It's responding to the most pressing issues and questions of modern life. The central theme of Gaudium et Spes is the idea that Christ fully reveals the human person to himself. So we understand our own humanity through the person of Christ. The document then explains what we can understand about the human person and human societies in light of Christ. So it covers a wide range of subjects, including the dignity of the human person, freedom, conscience, and responsibility, sin, suffering, and hope, marriage, family, love, culture, science, economic and social life, political life, the common good, the need for laws to be morally just, the evils of war and the attainment of peace, and the mission of the church and her relationship with social and political life. So it's a massive document that is basically picking up on all of the themes that have been coming through in church social teaching over the last nearly 100 years at this point. And then, as well as Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council also released a declaration called Dignitatis Humanae, the focus of which was on the importance of religious freedom. Okay, so that brings us to like the mid-1960s. And then in 1967, Pope Paul VI wrote an encyclical titled Populorum Progressio, or The Development of Peoples. So this encyclical was notable because it developed the concept of solidarity in more explicit terms than previous documents had. And solidarity is another one of those key principles of Catholic social teaching. In that encyclical, Paul VI also revisited and reinforced the themes of previous church documents. He talked about the obligation of richer nations to care for poorer ones, and he also reminded Christians that human development needs to be holistic. This is what the compendium refers to as an integral human development. So in other words, Paul VI drew attention to the fact that human flourishing means more than just economic flourishing or economic well-being. It means more than being wealthy, in other words. Human flourishing means that the whole human person needs to be developed, and that includes physical well-being, it includes education, respect for freedom and dignity, as well as spiritual development, social participation, and cultural growth. So that was Pope Paul VI in his 1967 encyclical Populorum Progressio. In 1971, Pope Paul VI released an apostolic letter called Octogesima Adveniens. In this letter, Paul VI applies Catholic social teaching specifically to like a modern post-industrial context. So now he's considering the challenges that are specific to the late 20th century, including issues of urbanization, the condition of young people, the condition of women, unemployment, discrimination, immigration, population growth, the influence of the means of social communications, and the ecological problem. So here we can start to see themes that are becoming more and more important to contemporary society. So again, the church is repeating the same principles, but also expanding on them and highlighting them in response to the kind of shifting needs of society over this century. And then in the 1980s and the early 1990s, Pope John Paul II did a huge amount to kind of consolidate and bring together all of the Catholic social teachings of the last 100 years. He released several major social encyclicals, including one called Laborem Exercens, which focused on the nature and meaning of work. and the way that work can contribute to the fundamental good of the human person. So John Paul II emphasized the fact that our everyday work can actually be the context in which a person can not only develop humanly, but can also develop spiritually. Work can be a path to holiness and to sanctity, and it's more than just an economic reality or necessity. And then in 1991, to mark the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, John Paul II promulgated the encyclical Centesimus Annus, which revisited and consolidated all of the teachings of Rerum Novarum, while also addressing the social and political questions of the late 20th century. So at this point, in 1991, we basically have a kind of full circle. We have a century of modern Catholic social teaching that addresses the major social and political questions of the 20th century, and that all deals with the same or similar themes, but applies them and develops them according to the needs of the time. In 2004, the Catholic Church released the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Catholic Church, which drew together everything that had been taught across all of these encyclicals over that 100 years and kind of systematically outlined and defined the key principles of Catholic social doctrine. So that compendium, that's what we're going to be going over in these episodes. The compendium basically draws together everything that the Church had been teaching over those 100 years and systematizes it and sets it out in an accessible way. But even since then, popes have continued to reinforce and to deepen this teaching. So for instance, Pope Benedict XVI emphasized the relationship between truth and charity in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate. He also warned that unchecked capitalism can encourage a culture of selfishness and inequality. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, criticized consumerism and the misuse and abuse of natural resources. And then in his apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis reiterated the right of all people to have dignified work, education, and healthcare, and affirmed that governments may legitimately intervene in the economy in order to promote the common good. And that brings us to the present day. So when our current Pope was elected last year, Pope Leo XIV, he explicitly said that he chose his name as a nod to Pope Leo XIII, who wrote Rerum Novarum. So this is a quote from Pope Leo XIV. He said that he chose his name mainly because Pope Leo XIII, in his historic encyclical Rerum Novarum, addressed the social question in the context of the first great industrial revolution. In our own day, the Church offers to everyone the treasury of her social teaching in response to another industrial revolution and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence that pose new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor. So what Pope Leo XIV is highlighting is the fact that we are currently undergoing another industrial revolution that requires a revisiting of these principles and ideas and requires us to apply them in again, another context, a context where we have artificial intelligence, a context where we have the rise of the internet, massive changes in social and economic and political life once again. So Pope Leo XIV sees the importance of continuing to revisit and understand church social doctrine. And that, to be honest, that's the reason why we're doing this deep dive, because Pope Leo XIV has kind of pointed out the importance for us as Catholics to understand Catholic social teaching and to be able to implement it in a 21st century context. So what we're going to do over the next few episodes is we're going to start looking at those principles and think about what they mean for us today in the 21st century. So that is going to be the substance of our next few episodes. We're going to start looking at the first part of the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Catholic Church from a 21st century perspective. Awesome! I can't wait. I am super excited. I hope that you are excited as well. I can't wait to dig deep into this incredibly important area of Catholic teaching. In the meantime, I hope that you have a fantastic fortnight, and I can't wait to talk to you in 2 weeks. Okay, bye.